going on? Give me Liberty fans. We got chapter 5 for you today. This one coming from the 4th edition of the textbook, but if you got another one, it'll match up. Make sure you check the description right now. I have so many videos that relate to this chapter. Lots of topics that are broken down and very important to understand to succeed in APUSH and really any history class. All right, let's get started. So we're talking about the crisis between the colonies and Britain. And a lot of this really goes back to the end of the 7 Years' War that ended in 1763. Britain is in a tremendous amount of debt. This is a turning point. This is actually the essay topic from the 2015 AP exam. So Britain and solitary neglect, they begin to take a more hands-on approach on the colonies. And this really drastically alters the relationship between the British and the colonists. So new acts were passed to regulate trade, and keep in mind, prior to 1763, trade was loosely enforced. Yes, there was a navigation acts, but for the most part, they weren't really enforced, and Americans got around it by smuggling. Britons were heavily taxed, and they felt that the burden should be extended to the colonists as well. Now, some colonists were upset that they didn't have representation. So the British government argued, yeah, bro, you're virtually represented. And this means that all the people living in the British Empire were represented in Parliament, even if they could not vote. And this was rejected by colonists. They didn't like this. Writs of assistance were created, and these were essentially open-ended search warrants that allowed British officials to search homes and especially ships for smuggled goods. And if somebody was caught smuggling, they would be tried in an admiralty court where they were guilty until proven innocent. And there was no trial by jury. Lots of tension this creates between the colonists and the British as well. Currency Act was created, and this prohibited colonies from printing paper money, and they must use hard currency or gold and silver. All right, Stamp Act. You see it starred. Wicked important. Stamp Act. This was a direct tax on the colonists to raise revenue. This was not approved by the colonial assemblies, so this is an example of taxation without representation. It was a tax on 50 commonly used goods, paper goods like cards, newspapers, marriage licenses, you name it. If it's made out of paper, chances are it was taxed. And this affected virtually all colonists. This was the first tax that no matter where you were living as a colonist, you would be affected by this. So Americans began to view themselves as equals to the British counterparts, and the British government's like, no, bro, Parliament Supreme, you guys ain't equal, sorry. In America, we have this rallying cry of no taxation without representation, and this was used by the colonists to say, hey, we want representation in Parliament. And here is how the Stamp Act was viewed in America. You see it as a symbol of death or awfulness. So stamp collectors were hanged in effigy. Effigy is when you make like a straw man or a fake person and you hang them and you label them as, let's say, a stamp collector. And committees and organizations emerged to resist the Stamp Act. Most notably, the Stamp Act Congress, which was a colonial organization to boycott the Stamp Act. And we'll see that it's successful in the colonies. So Sons of Liberty was a new group that emerged, and they emerged to resist British taxes, and they would harass stamp collectors, and they had support from craftsmen, laborers, and merchants. And after much American resistance, Parliament will repeal the Stamp Act in 1776 because economically it is hard to enforce. Now, this is a turning point. This is hugely important. The colonists realize if they resist or put up a fight with any tax or act, that the British will eventually give in. Now, in the 1760s, we have a movement called the Regulator Movement, and these people were upset about underrepresentation for Western settlements in the South Carolina Assembly. So you have poor people living out on the Western frontier. They're upset about underrepresentation, kind of a similar idea to Bacon's Rebellion. They criticized the wealthy, and eventually in 1771, they were suppressed by the South Carolina militia. Present-day Vermont, we have conflicts that emerged between New Yorkers and New Englanders over land. And colonial elites, really, these two issues helped illustrate that colonial elites feared challenges to British authority might also result in challenges to colonial authority. So these are kind of movements of lower class individuals that are resisting elites, colonial elites. Okay, Townshend Acts. These were created by Charles Townshend. Here he is. It was a tax on glass, tea, lead, and paint. John Dickinson writes his very famous book, Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, and he argued for reconciliation with Britain and that the colonists should be treated like Englishmen. Basically, he's arguing for, let's go back to the days of salutary neglect where we all got along so well. And this was a very, very popular best-selling book. Many colonists encouraged purchasing of homespun clothing or clothing that is made in the United States as a way of boycotting British-made goods. Daughters of Liberty were women who made homespun clothing and became very helpful in this movement. And artisans benefited greatly from the boycotts because their products were now being bought instead of British ones. Now, in Boston, we have the very famous Boston Massacre. And to understand this, let's go back a little bit. And many British soldiers wanted second jobs besides being soldiers. And they would compete with colonists for these jobs, which would increase tensions. Now, in March of 1770, there's a colonial crowd that is very upset, and they are pelting the British soldiers with snowballs, with rocks, and they're yelling things at them. Now, nobody really knows why the British fired, but they began to fire onto the crowd, killing 5 Americans, including Crispus Attucks, who is African American, and generally considered to be the first person killed in the American Revolution. Now, Paul Revere, who was a famous printer, jumps on this, and he creates this engraving, and he titles it, you can see up here, The Bloody Massacre. So it really portrays the colonists as this innocent group here, just peacefully standing there, and the British shooting at them. And this really, really, really helps increase tensions as well. John Wilkes was a member of Parliament that was critical of the king, and he really became like a folk hero or a rallying cry in the colonies. Many people looked up to him. The Tea Act was created to bail out the near bankrupt British East India Company, and what it does was it puts a tax on tea. Now, interestingly enough, the price of tea was cheaper than smuggled tea, but the colonists still boycotted it because they hated taxes so much. So they were against all taxes. They were willing to pay more for smuggled tea because there wasn't a tax on it. And as a result of the Tea Act, we have the Boston Tea Party that occurred. Now, in response to that, Britain passes the Intolerable or the Coercive Acts. They closed the port of Boston. They instituted a new quartering act in which the soldiers could stay in the homes of people living there. And they also revoked Massachusetts charter. At the same time, they passed something known as the Quebec Act, which extended the boundary of Canada to the Ohio Valley. So American colonists are very concerned because they think the Canadian border is encroaching on their land, and the Quebec Act also provided legal protection for Catholics, which many Protestant American colonists were very weary of. And many colonists feared that Britain was strengthening Catholicism at their expense. So the Quebec Act angered many American colonists as well. So let's jump over to the Continental Congress. This was created in response to the Intolerable Acts. The Suffolk Resolves encouraged disobedience to laws, encouraged people not to pay taxes, and ultimately to help prepare for war. The Continental Congress was made up of all colonies except for Georgia, and they included people like John Adams and George Washington. Patrick Henry gave his very famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death," that really became a rallying cry as well. Now, the association encouraged no trade with Britain in the West Indies, and committees of safety developed, and they were created to help transition power from colonial governments in which the British government had control to grassroots organizations. And colonists based their arguments on natural rights, their rights to elect individuals, to not pay taxes without consent. And many, many, many colonists wanted to be seen as equals in the British Empire, which the British did not share the same view. Okay, let's jump on over to Lexington and Concord. April of 1775, more than 1 year prior to the American Declaration of Independence, there is a conflict between the colonists and the British. Now, Britain sought to seize colonial arms stationed there, and this was known as the shot heard round the world. And the colonists pushed the British soldiers back. Now, in June of that same year, 1775, we have Breed's Hill, which was incorrectly called Breed's Hill. It's actually called Bunker Hill. This was the Battle of Bunker Hill, in which the colonists took a surprisingly high number of British casualties. Now, in 1776, the Second Continental Congress was created, and they elected George Washington as commander of the colonial military. And they are going to be the ones that ultimately push for the Declaration of Independence. Now, throughout 1775, it's very important to know most Americans did not want independence. Rather, they simply wanted to go back to the days of salutary neglect. The governor of Virginia, seeing that war was kind of imminent, offered freedom to slaves that fought on behalf of the British. And this really angered a lot of plantation owners, some of which were loyal to the British crown. Now, in January of 1776, a very famous book is written, Common Sense. It's starred, you gotta know it. I have a video on it, check the description below. But before we get to that, we're going to talk about the Olive Branch Petition, which sought reconciliation with King George III in Great Britain. This was after the fighting, and King George III says no. Thomas Paine, or T-Paine, comes along, and he argues that it's common sense for America to break away from England. And this pamphlet becomes a bestseller in the colonies, sells hundreds of thousands of copies. So it's written to appeal to common people. It avoided complex language. So it's not written to the audience of the elites, but rather to the average everyday colonist. This was issued, as I mentioned, in January of 1776, and independence happened 6 months later in July. So the Declaration of Independence was written primarily by this dude, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote it when he was 33 years old. I'm 33 years old. I'm having a mini midlife crisis because I haven't done anything like that. Now, what this did was it provided a list of grievances against King George III, and it drew on a lot of Enlightenment ideas, like natural rights, John Locke's life, liberty, and property. He changed to life, liberty, and, you know it, the pursuit of happiness. So laws of nature, he argued, justified independence, and there was even some inspiration from John Locke's social contract that rulers have responsibility to the ruled. So American exceptionalism is this belief that America really served as a symbol of freedom for the rest of the world. And this really has been a major idea throughout most of American history. The Declaration of Independence inspired people from around the world. You see it in present-day Belgium and in many areas of Latin America. And this dude, Simon Bolivar, if you took AP World History, any world history class, you learned about him. Many independence movements were inspired in Latin America. And many people around the world began to believe in the belief that, you know what, average everyday people do have rights that the government should protect. All right, let's talk about British advantages during the war. They had a better trained army with more men. They had Hessian soldiers who were these really bad German soldier dudes that were hired to fight. And they had an elite navy, the best navy in the entire world. America had home field advantage. They had a stronger will, and they had really good leadership by people like George Washington. Some slaves acquired freedom through fighting on behalf of the Americans during the Revolution, and blacks under Washington fought in integrated units. So they were fighting side by side with whites. The next time this would happen would be the Korean War in the 1950s. The Virginia legislature emancipated some slaves, or freed some slaves that fought in the American Revolution. And Washington's surprise attack on the Hessians in the early years of the war really increased the morale of the troops. Battle of Saratoga, it starred, know this bad boy. Here's a painting of it. You can check it out in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. It's an enormous painting. Check it out. It'll be a great time. In October of 1777, General Burgoyne of the American side defeated the British. This was a turning point because France then entered the war on behalf of the American colonists. They began to provide aid to them. And the reason they did this was they hoped to regain lost land from the 7 Years' War. Now, they never got it back, but they did hope for it. In 1780, it was a really bad year. Congress was almost bankrupt. Benedict Arnold, he defected to the British side, became known as America's most famous traitor, and American colonists engaged in guerrilla warfare throughout much of the South. Now, Marquis de Lafayette, he was this French dude, became buddies with George Washington. He played an instrumental role in the war. The Battle of Yorktown, this was the last major battle of the war, considered the final battle of the Revolutionary War, and the Americans win. And the Treaty of Paris provided that the British would recognize U.S. independence. The U.S. gained control all the way to the Mississippi River, and they also gained fishing rights off of Canada. All right, let's do a quick recap. End of salutary neglect. Why did that happen? What were its impacts? No, the Stamp Act Congress, the Townsend Acts. What were those taxes on? The Tea Act, how that led to the Boston Tea Party, and how the Boston Tea Party led to the Intolerable Acts. Homespun movement, what was it? What was the goal? Common Sense, who wrote it? What was the message? Was it influential? If so, how? The impact of the Declaration of Independence on the world, the British and American advantages during the war, and finally the Battle of Saratoga. toga. All right, guys, look forward to seeing you right back here for Chapter 6. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. And thank you guys very much for watching. Have a good day.